Hello, Civics scholars. Welcome to another edition of a awesome civics discussion. We're going to do an overview today of civil liberties. We've just completed our unit on civil rights. So a lot of students often ask, well, Mr. Batchelor, what's the difference between civil rights and civil liberties? Since you asked, to give you the Civics 101 answer, we just looked at civil rights where a lot of protections were given to groups that had their um, rights denied, faced discrimination. So the government gave many of these groups added protection. So these were basically like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protected people based on religion, national origin, protections against things like discrimination in employment. So these were protections given by the government. Civil liberties is different in where you are um, given rights by the government to limit the government. These are supposed to be rights that can't be taken away so that the federal government can't be too powerful. We kind of looked at this when we discussed our debate on the Bill of Rights in our Constitutional Convention. But once again, as we've talked about all year, even though you have these civil liberties, none of them, and yes, none of them are absolute. So the government does take them away at times. And that's where our constitutional issues come up. And we will discuss several of them this unit. Okay. So to define civil liberties, they're personal rights. They're freedoms that the federal government cannot abridge, either by law, constitution, or judicial interpretation. Okay, that is the textbook definition of civil liberties. Once again, the likes of the Thomas Jefferson and the Anti-Federalist put these in place to limit the powers of the national government. Okay. So here's a nice little chart on distinguishing civil liberties from civil rights. Civil liberties on your left, your basic freedoms and liberties, things like freedom of speech, uh, search and seizure of the Fourth Amendment. You're not supposed to be searched without probable cause or perhaps a warrant. So those are some of your civil liberties. Most of them got expanded by the 14th Amendment. We'll talk about how in a little bit. And they're primarily set up to restrict the government um, from doing things to you. Okay? Civil rights were protection from discrimination, as we saw. It could be women, African Americans, minorities, same-sex marriage. Those were all civil rights that were given, okay? And most of them come out of the 14th Amendment. If you remember, even Brown versus Board of Education, 14th Amendment, okay? So they're designed to protect you from discrimination by the government and other individuals. So going back, we discussed this earlier in the year, that look, I've called the Constitution a negative document because um, the founding fathers, most of them, wanted to limit the power of the government. So they're not writing this Constitution to give the national government more power. They framed it on limiting the power. That's why we have three branches of government, okay? Checks and balances. But as you know, our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, those guidelines on your civil liberties are very broad. What constitutes freedom of speech? What constitutes freedom of religion? We've learned that none of them are absolute, so a lot of times the courts have to decide when there's a dispute. Okay? Talked about the civil liberties really did not apply to state issues or state governments for the first 100 years of our history, basically. This Supreme Court case, Barron versus Baltimore, okay, um, the city government of Baltimore was taking away or harming some of Barron's property. So he believed his Fifth Amendment rights were being stepped on. So he brought it to the Supreme Court in 1833. And the court ruled that the Bill of Rights did not apply to state governments. That was only to the national government. So here, you're seeing the Bill of Rights not having, such a profound protection for individuals, really up and through the Civil War. So this case was very important in terms of the American government because it stated the Bill of Rights did not restrict the state governments when it came to violating civil liberties. Let me hide this thing. Always gets in my way. So this would stay. The 14th Amendment did not formally overturn this, but once that was passed, Barron versus Baltimore did not always apply, and as time went on, basically never applied. Okay? So, once again, that Supreme Court case limited the Bill of Rights prior to the Civil War and really did not apply to anything the state government did until 1868 when the 14th Amendment was passed. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. That made the Barron decision pretty insignificant after that. Okay, let's look at the incorporation doctrine. This is known, as we've discussed, the nature of the Bill of Rights is to limit the national government. Okay. The 14th Amendment was added, and its language suggested that the protections of the Bill of Rights must also be extended to prevent state infringement of those rights. So that expanded civil liberties to more citizens. So let's look at a few of these amendments, and we're going to discuss these in a variety of situations. The First Amendment, if you look at what I read out here to summarize, basically it gives you freedom of speech, freedom of press, the right of the people to assemble and to petition a government. Okay, we've talked about this earlier in the year, and we're going to look at a lot of different situations because, once again, you don't have an absolute right to any of them. Okay, and this is a nice little diagram of them. We'll talk about freedom of religion. You have the free exercise. The government really shouldn't infringe on your free exercise, and the government should not endorse one religion over another. Okay. Freedom of expression is a variety of things. Freedom of assembly, freedom to petition a government. We saw the freedom of assembly and petition a government used by a lot of civil rights groups. Your freedom of speech. But once again, we'll talk about how some of these are not protected, and of course, freedom of press. And sometimes the government can limit what the press is going to broadcast. So, what are some of the actions not protected by the First Amendment? When we do an activity, I'm going to give you a variety of simulations that actually happened. I'm going to change the names on them, and you're going to have to decide whether the speech was protected or not. Okay? Symbolic speech, things like sit-ins that were used in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement in the 1960s, they were limited at times. Wearing armbands, we saw the Supreme Court case in Tinker expand your rights to wear armbands to school when it came to protesting the Vietnam War. So when it comes to denying your symbolic speech, whether you decide to wear an armband, whether you decide to have it sit in, the government must show an important reason to restrict actions. So at times your demonstration may hamper business, it may hamper the education process, and if they feel that it does, that First Amendment sometimes can be limited. Okay, but the standard is the government must show an important reason to restrict those actions. Obscenity. The portrayal of sex can be restricted by the government. Nudity can be restricted by the government if it's an offensive or lewd manner that exceeds standards of decency. Okay, that sounds, pretty easy to apply, but once again, two people, one may see something as obscene. Let's just say it's a nude picture. Some may see that as art. Okay, so what happens when there's that type of dispute? Well, the Supreme Court has actually written in some of its decisions that, obscenity, you know it when you see it. But once again, it's a case by case basis. So these cases come up all the time because what's obscene to one person may not be obscene to another. Here are some other ones not fully protected in the First Amendment. Fighting words. Are the words likely to incite a fight? Will it cause a fight? Just because you may say something about fighting words or threats or things like that, it does not always lead to denial of those words. But if those words are likely to incite an illegal response or violence, they're not fully protected. Child pornography, perjury, lying under oath, blackmail, basically offering money for something, incitement to an imminent lawless act. Let's just say you're demonstrating and you do something that's likely to elicit an illegal activity, an illegal response, a fight, a riot. If those words are likely to cause that action, they are not protected. True threats, once again, fighting words and true threats. True threats is a higher standard. And basically, you can't solicit people to commit crimes. Two of the other significant ones you should know: defamation. You cannot knowingly say something false to hurt somebody's reputation. The standard is it's false. It's going to hurt that person's reputation. So if you say it, that's slander. If you write it, it's libel. Okay, so we'll look at some cases on that. Commercial speech applies to businesses. A good way to remember this is false advertising. You can't just say, okay, we're making the best donuts and they're healthy for you and they have no calories. Meanwhile, you find out there's all this saturated fat in them. There are 350 calories per bite. Of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but when businesses advertise, the information they give in those advertisements should be accurate and not misleading. Okay, so that's commercial speech. Okay, right to assemble and petition the government. We'll look at some of these cases. You should have a right to, issue your grievances, protest to public officials, other individuals. But once again, there are time, manner, and place restrictions. You can't just go any place, any time, in any manner and protest. You can't disrupt business. You sometimes can't disrupt traffic flow. So normally, you'll have to get a permit to do these things. So courts have allowed municipalities to require permits for demonstrations so public officials can control safety issues. Okay, time, manner, and place. Can you do it in a park? Can you do it at a school? Could you do it at businesses? These are all things that come into play here. And we're going to look at some of those situations as well. Freedom of religion. Once again, we talked a little bit about this earlier in the year. The government cannot endorse one religion over another. Jefferson called this the wall of separation between church and state. You hear that term all the time. It's not written in the Constitution, but that's basically Jefferson's comment on that. Okay, so we'll look at some cases by that. The government cannot favor one religion over another. And then it gets tricky when you start dealing with atheists who will challenge basically if the government talks about religion at all. So the Free Exercise Clause protects your right to worship or believe as you choose. Once again, you don't have the right to do that any place, anywhere, anytime. Okay, we learn there's no prayer in schools. Okay, so traditionally in a classroom, you're not normally allowed to do that. Obviously, if you have to pray at a certain time and day, the school might have to accommodate you by giving you a spot to do that. But, once again, This is not an absolute right, but they are protected, but those beliefs may at times be restricted. It comes to school vouchers is a big issue with this. You know, to give you the short summary of this, some taxpayers believe if they send their kid to a religious school, they should get a voucher from the money that they have been sending to the public school through their property taxes and apply it to a private school. Okay. But, once again, the state is supposed to provide a public school. If they're taking that tax money and applying it to a religious school, is that a violation of the Establishment Clause? Okay. So courts have ruled, especially recently, that some people can use a voucher for private or homeschooling. Freedom of the press, we talked about this. In your newspapers, magazines, books, radio, and TV, we've learned that there's all types of censorship. It could be on foul language, could be on obscenity. Especially broadcast television, there's a lot more censorship on. If you subscribe to something like HBO or a pay channel, there's less censorship because you subscribe to that. So if the government finds the materials offensive that are being broadcast on television, on the radio, put in books, magazines, they can at times censor the publications. Okay? This is the DJ Howard Stern, who was one of the United States' first shock jocks, as they were called, in the late 70s, early 80s. He would say things on the radio people up to that time hadn't said before. And he used to get a lot of fines from the FCC, which monitors these type of things. So normally you'll see broadcast media does not get the same free speech protections or free press protections that you see in other forms. If you get XM radio or something like that, once again, that's a subscription-based radio. So prior restraint is another term you should know. When the government tries to censor materials or a publication, the courts will always first say this is unconstitutional, and it will only be allowed if the publication would cause harm and the prior restraint would avoid the harm. Let's just say something comes out in the war effort. Let's put it in the Vietnam War, and Nixon and the government is trying to suppress something the New York Times wants to print negatively about the war, but that information will put soldiers in danger. And if this is printed, those soldiers could be hurt or killed or taken hostage. If it's shown that the publication of that article would do that, then the government or the courts could rule with prior restraint. Okay, but it's the government's burden to show that there would be harm or threaten national security if it was published. So that's prior restraint. Privacy rights. We've talked about this a bit. Nowhere in the Constitution does it give you a right to privacy, but there is an expectation of privacy. Okay, and courts understand that. Okay, so from the First Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Ninth Amendment, the government is not supposed to trample on your privacy rights. Okay, but we've also seen your expansion of privacy rights through Roe v. Wade, where a woman and her doctor, the court ruled, should be making the decision what's best for the mother or the child. And they basically said Jane Doe had a right to privacy. Okay, so the same thing with when it came with the birth control issue several years before. Other privacy rights. You get to the end of your life, or you have a loved one, end of your life, who's suffering. Should you be able to have an assisted suicide by a medical professional to put your relative or yourself out of your misery, or you're in a vegetative state? Most courts have said there are some states that do allow assisted suicide, but most states say you should have a living will. That's something in addition to just a plain will. For instance, a living will say if you get in a situation where you're put on a ventilator and there's no other means to keep you alive, and you're going to be a vegetative state for the rest of your life. Um, what would you like to happen in that situation? If you don't want to remain in a vegetative state on a ventilator for years, you can put in your living will, do not resuscitate. Do not put on a ventilator. You would have to talk to an attorney about that who handles the state law. Okay. Wiretapping. This has come under increasing controversy since the 1960s. Um, After 9/11, a lot of courts have eased searches without a warrant to listen to your phone calls, to monitor your emails, things like that. So privacy rights have kind of uh, been restricted for individuals after 9/11. Fourth Amendment, we did some of these cases earlier in the year, and we'll do some more here, I believe. Basically, if a government is going to get a search warrant, they have to show probable cause. I know we went over an exercise where there are exemptions to the Fourth Amendment, but in most cases, the government has to show probable cause in order to conduct a search. If not, the exclusionary rule applies. Fifth Amendment, we're going to do a case known as the Miranda versus Arizona case. Basically, your self-protection to incrimination. No coerced confessions. You'll find you have the right to remain silent once under arrest. But once again, you're going to find things that sometimes will hurt you in these cases. The Sixth Amendment. This pretty much gets into your due process of law. We saw in a Supreme Court case, the Gideon case, you have a right to counsel. And if you can't afford that counsel, it must be provided for you. You should know the charges that have been set against you. You should get a speedy trial, and it should be won by an impartial jury. Okay. Eighth Amendment deals with no cruel and unusual punishment. Most of the time, that deals with the death penalty, and the bail should be reasonable. Okay. Well, if you shoplift, first offense, they shouldn't set a bail for you at $7 million. If you don't know what bail is something you post to get out of jail while you await trial. Okay. Not everybody's eligible for bail. If you are considered a risk to society or a risk to flee, you may have to stay in jail without bail. That's up to a judge until your trial. We talked about the Fifth Amendment. A lot of times your interrogations by police are being filmed so they can protect themselves, that you were read your rights, okay, especially with the Fifth Amendment. And we talked about the exclusionary rule, where they cannot obtain evidence against you illegally. If they do, they can't use it in the court of law. That's what the exclusionary rule is about. So I hope this was informative. We're going to look at a lot of these situations moving forward. And I hope to see you soon, and enjoy the rest of your day.